All right, so the very first thing you want to do when establishing a pecan orchard is figure out if it's really the right path for you or for your stakeholder, kind of to guide them to really look and see if this is the right path for them. A misconception about pecans is that you can just plant them and sort of leave them alone, that they do not need much management. And that's just not true at all. And we'll talk about that a little more in this presentation. Another thing to keep in mind when thinking about establishing a pecan orchard is they will not produce profitable yields for 10 to 15 years, and they are a significant investment up front. And they do require intense pruning the first 3 years and about 12 fungicide and insecticide applications per year. They require irrigation, fertility, weed control, and very expensive specialized equipment. Custom harvesters are needed, an air blast, a shaker, a lift. And if an orchard is not going to purchase that machinery, they need to know if there's a custom harvester or applicator in their area. And there are some dispersed around Arkansas that will come and harvest and spray and do those sort of things. So basically, they need to take all of this into consideration and really look at the economics. And there's a lot of numbers thrown out there. On average, the estimated cost to start a pecan orchard is about $4,000 per acre. You can do it a lot cheaper than that, but $4,000 is about the average if you're putting in irrigation. You're putting in seedling. You're not putting in seedling trees. You're putting in trees that are bare root and that have already been grafted. So that's a good estimate. So what do pecan trees like? After you've done an economic analysis and decided that it's a good route for you to go, what do they like? The most important thing is finding a good spot, finding a good piece of land. Pecan trees really like deep, fertile, well-drained soils. They prefer 30 to 36 inches of topsoil. That's why they do so good in the Delta regions and around a lot of rivers. But of course, they'll grow here in Clarksville, Arkansas, where our topsoil is 6 inches. They'll grow in other areas, but they will never produce top-notch yield when they're not in those deep topsoils. Most pecan roots are concentrated in the top 6 to 18 inches of soil. This is really important to think about, especially from an irrigation perspective. I hear a lot of people say, oh, I don't need to irrigate my pecans because the water table is very low. Well, when all of your roots are concentrated in the top 6 to 18 inches, you're still going to have to provide irrigation there for them. And they require a lot of water, 60 inches a year, and that's during growing season. So we're talking April through November, and they need 60 inches a year. If you can't provide 60 inches a year, which in Arkansas, we do not get that level of rainfall, irrigation must be installed. On average, they require about 3,000 gallons of water per acre per day in summer months. Lack of water is the #1 reason for death in new orchards. So for folks trying to establish young and new trees. When you're thinking about establishing an orchard, it's really important to think about airflow. Pecan scab is one of the most common diseases for pecans in Arkansas. with good airflow, it can drastically decrease pecan scab pressure. Also, there's been some studies, and Lenny looked at some of this in Georgia and found that elevation really does matter when it comes to pecan scab infestation. And about 300 foot is ideal for pecans, which, you know, we're not near 300 foot in the Delta regions where a lot of pecans are produced. We start getting there in central Arkansas, and you all know we have some really productive pecan orchards in those areas. And this is just an example of, this isn't a pecan orchard, but just you want good airflow. Orchards that are completely surrounded by forest, you know, can cause frost pockets, very poor airflow, higher disease pressure. And believe it or not, pecans are susceptible to freeze damage. We lost some crop this year because we had a late freeze at the end of April. So some of the southern part of the state lost some of their crop this year. So, you know, higher ground, good airflow is always going to be the best choice. I always like to talk about a year zero. Always take 1 year to prep an area you plan to plant pecans, or really any type of perennial crop. You want a soil test. The soil needs to be about 6.5 to 7 as for pH, and make sure to apply lime where needed to get that up if it's not in that range. It's really difficult for pecans or any plants to utilize, you know, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus if that soil pH is low. Basically, the tree just can't uptake the nutrients that it needs to survive and produce good yield. Nitrogen really isn't very important the very first year they're planted. They will work off a lot of the stores they already have. But pre-plant incorporating some phosphorus and potassium is a good idea. Those take a little bit longer to move through the soil profile. So, you know, just mix some of those in there according to what your soil test shows you. Also think about subsoiling. You may have to suggest folks do that if a hard pan is present. And the recommendation for orchards is that it is conducted about 24 to 30 inches deep if a hard pan is present. Now, when you're clearing an area to plant, make sure that all of the brush is pulled out of the planting area before you burn it, because if you burn that, it's going to create a really basic environment and make the pH really off in that one area, and it's really hard to get that one area back into good shape where there's been a lot of burning. And then finally, eradicate weeds in the areas to be planted. You know, you can do this with burn downs and cover crops, all good methods to get the weed populations under control. Pick an orchard layout. So one of the most popular orchard layouts is a square, and the most common planting distance is 40 by 40. And this will give about 27 trees per acre. 30 by 60 is another one I've seen done, and that gives about 24 trees per acre. High density isn't really practiced here much. It's 35 trees or more per acre. And that's practiced mainly in New Mexico. They have much longer day lengths than we do, so they can do more high density plantings. At full maturity, though, you'll probably be down to about 7 trees per acre, because in all of these planting patterns, you have to thin the trees down. So your first thinning will generally be between 16 to 22 years after planting, or when 50% of the orchard floor is shaded. You'll want to go in and selectively remove the trees. Also, along with these squares, you can plant on the diagonal in what we call a triangle. And we see this pattern quite a bit. I like this way of doing things. You would selectively remove the tree in the middle. Let's see. And then I have an example of thinning. So here, this is an initial planting of 40 by 40. And everywhere there's a P is where the tree is going to be permanent. Okay. Where there's a 1, that is where the tree is removed in the first thinning. And the 2 is when it's removed at the second thinning. Generally, everything is planned to where there will be 2 thinning dates. So you can see what you end up with at first thinning, about 16 to 22 years. You're setting at about 14 trees per acre. And then 7 trees per acre, the final thinning is at 25 to 30. You see, you get a little more, I guess, time between thinnings when you plant in that triangle or staggered configuration versus the square. One thing that's really important to mention to growers, or if you are growers, make sure when things are planted that it's properly squared off. It's really important that these rows are nice and straight, so all your machinery can get in there really well. Another thing we have to worry about with pecans is they do require pollinators. So pollinator cultivars need to be planted within about 150 feet of cultivars to be pollinated. And so you really need to pick these cultivars very carefully. First off, when you're designing your orchard, you're going to have to make sure that you're not taking out all of your pollinators and you still have some in existence when you're down here in year 25 or 30. So a lot of thought does have to be put into the planning phases. Now, what you're going to pick, it's really going to be based on the market, what market a grower is going for, whether that's selling to a sheller or doing some type of wholesale. Shellers prefer really large pecans, whereas if you're doing maybe some more retail, then you could go with a smaller type kernel. So how do you pick pollinators? There's all different types of charts. So you can pick complements for certain types. And I pulled this one up because it has a couple that are planted a lot in Arkansas. So Pawnee, and everywhere there's a green square is one that is a complement to Pawnee. Elliott is one. Kansas, and that is planted a lot in Arkansas, Pawnee and Kansas. Oh, let's see. Morrill, we don't plant that one much. Stewart is okay. So it just gives you Caddo is all right. So make sure you suggest to growers to consult these charts and really look at what is complementary to one another. Because with pecans, some of them produce these catkins, which release the pollen pretty early, and they are not self-pollinating. And when they do self-pollinate, the quality is usually pretty low. So you definitely want some complementary pollinators. So planting trees. A lot of folks ask me about grafting, and grafting really is not recommended, especially if you're establishing a larger orchard. It's very high labor cost, delayed production, high mortality, or I would say low level of take. And weed competition, you have to fight the weeds a little bit longer. So if you were going to graft in a large orchard, you would plant seeds, wait 2 years until those produce seedlings, graft the budwood onto those seedlings, and sort of hope for the best. So it's a very long process. You know, what I suggest folks do, and it is more expensive, but you're about 3 years ahead of the game if you just plant bare root trees that have already been grafted. When you're planting bare root trees, make sure that those roots are kept moist until planting. If it's going to be a little while until you plant, heel them in. We do that a lot here at Fruit Research Station with things that we graft until we can plant them. Holes should be about 3 to 4 feet. You just want to make sure you accommodate the depth of the roots and they're not bending. You don't want to plant them too deep. There's quite a bit of research out there that does suggest root pruning when you plant is very, very good for pecan trees. So pruning back lateral roots and then cutting back that tap root. Now for pecans, since this is a pretty big root system, you want to make sure that there's no air surrounding those roots to give them the best chance. So what this means is you need to plant with water. And how this is done, so in the hole, you'll usually start filling it in about a quarter full of water, and then begin filling with dirt and just alternate with water and dirt until you get to the top with the water, and then just fill it in with the dirt. Level it around the soil, and there's no need to pack it in. And this is really helpful to keep those air pockets from forming. So after they are planted, it's really important to prune. So after plant, you'll prune usually a half to 1/3 of the top of the tree, and you'll remove any lateral branches. This is tough for folks, but this is really important because that tree is going to be in shock after planting. And it will help the tree get established, and it will have a whole lot less to have to support while it's in that state of shock and trying to get a good root system established. And when you're cutting, make sure all cuts are at angles. And when you top that tree, make sure you're leaving a good bud that faces the southeast. And this is what is going to become the central leader. And then you want to rub off all the other buds close to that, except the top 2. You want to put trunk protectors on the tree for about 3 years. Pecan trees have very thin bark that is not hardened off until about year 3. You can use 4-inch corrugated drain pipe. There's a lot of different types of things you can use. Very important to remember not to contact the trunk with any herbicides, especially Roundup. Roundup will kill the trees if they have repeated exposures over those time periods. So keep that in mind. Now, pruning in general, once these trees are planted, there's many, many different ways to do it. Like I said, you can prune everything back and top it. And then, you know, some folks will leave the lateral branches that are growing until they're about 1 inch in diameter and then prune them off. There's really no right or wrong way. They both work. To me, getting them off of there is just a little bit easier and less labor intensive. You know, your laterals, you're going to be doing this for about 3 years. You're probably not going to be leaving many lateral branches until about year 3, because you don't want laterals and scaffold limbs to be much lower than 6 feet, because all of your machinery has to fit underneath these trees. So that's something to keep in mind. So there's just an example of what it would look like the first summer. So you would cut it back, and then all of these little lateral buds are going to break. You have some foliage. You'll prune off these lower limbs, and this is what it would look like after pruning. Okay. And this guy would probably be your central leader. So irrigation is very important. Chris talked about that at the last meeting, but I just want to stress that when you're establishing an orchard, it's very important to have irrigation in place. Weed competition, they will compete for both water and nutrients, and we recommend a 6x6 weed-free area in orchards that are becoming established. Once trees are mature, we recommend that weed-free area is about a 10-foot circumference around that tree. Use contact herbicides to maintain that weed-free area. That's things like AIM and paraquat. Use Roundup carefully. I'm not saying don't use it. It's used a lot in pecan orchards. You just have to be very careful. Make sure you're not spraying weeds that are taller than your weed guards. You know, you have to be very careful. It has to be a good day. You can also mulch. Mulch is expensive and it's not done a lot, but it is an option, and I think probably a good option for some smaller orchards. So these little trees in our area, they need about 10 to 20 gallons per tree per week. You know, if you're in a sandy soil, it's going to be upwards to 50 gallons per tree per week. And then it's always best to break up the irrigation into multiple days per week versus just giving them everything all at once. And this is just a picture at Fruit Research Station of how we manage our pecans. We leave a weed-free strip. This looks really good. You can see we're not perfect. Every once in a while, some things get away from us, but for the most part, we leave about a 10-foot strip around the plants. A little bit about fertility. So frequent applications are much better than just applying one large application of nitrogen. The first year, you're going to wait at least until June, and you're only going to apply fertilizer if you have really good growth. We recommend 5-10-15 or 10-10-10 around the tree. And always make sure if you're talking to folks about applying fertilizer that you mention not to apply it within 12 inches of the trunk. I've seen a lot of injury from folks not applying fertilizer correctly. Another thing that we have to do with pecans that's a little different, than other crops or trees is apply zinc sulfate. And they require zinc. So 1 to 2 pounds per 100 gallons applied foliarly when actively growing. And so this is usually April through June. We recommend 2 to 3 applications in the first year. Of course, you want to wait until the buds have broken and you do have a little foliage to make the application too. But we want to apply it when they're actively growing fast. Pest control. I get this question a lot. Should you manage pests in an orchard that is, 1 year old or just getting established? And pest control is very important at this time period because you want to protect all of that foliage that you can to keep the tree going. So I recommend that all growers keep at least 4 different pesticides on hand. The first one is methoxyfenazide, and that is a caterpillar product. We have a lot of caterpillar pests in pecans. This one's going to be really important for first year pests. We had issues with armyworm all over and all different crops this year in Arkansas. And I seen them defoliate some pretty young orchards. Lambda cyluthrin, this is Warrior. That can also be used for a range of different pests that methoxyfenazide just can't touch. And these are things like beetles and stink bugs and things like that. A miticide is very important to keep on hand. I have found that, some co-ops don't always keep miticides in stock. So I always suggest to growers to keep one around. Pecan leaf scorch mite, I've seen it around the state quite regularly, and it causes complete defoliation of the tree if it is not controlled. So a miticide, and there's a ton of them. Acromite, Agarmec, Oberon are just a few. And a imidacloprid product. So this is mainly used for aphid control in pecans, and aphids can significantly impact growth in pecans because they produce honeydew. And so a sooty mold will develop on that leaf. So the leaf cannot, get enough sunlight to produce the nutrients the tree needs. So I always recommend having those 4. Then you're also going to want to have 2 to 3 fungicides, Abound, Pristine, Stratego. There's a long list in the MP 154. So 2 to 3 fungicides, and you're going to apply those to keep pecan scab at bay. So you want to put out, 2 to 3 fungicide applications that first year. You want to protect your foliage as much as you can. It'll also just be based on weather. When we have really dry weather, pecan scab, and there's just not as much pressure. So, whenever we have the wet, rainy weather, you'll definitely want to get a fungicide application before we have that weather period. So our next meeting is October 12th at 11:30. And Dr. Wells from UGA will be here, and he's going to talk about renovating pecan orchards. And I wanted to invite him because I get a lot of questions around the state about renovating older pecan orchards, and there seems to be a lot of interest about just buying orchards and bringing them back into production or bringing them into a higher level of production. And he is the pecan hort specialist at University of Georgia. And I believe they're usually in the top 3 for pecan production in the United States. So he has a lot of experience. And that's all I have for today. I'd be happy to take any questions that you guys have.